you should do it, Peter. Excellent. Read it.
Hello, everybody. How are you
I want
doing?
you to read it and keep your head down the whole time.
So what you're witnessing right now is basically what happened with these books. The goods and the bads of having a large number of collaborators working on a single project. I think in the end, it was an extraordinary experience for both groups, but getting to the end was an amazing challenge, and we're going to talk about some of those things today. I guess first of all, Peter and I are just going to introduce, first of all, welcome to Design Media Arts. And you can see, one moment.
I got it.
Yeah.
No, you want that?
Yeah. I just want to introduce our next event, which is January 29th, which Jörg Lenny, who's our Arts Council visiting professor, is giving a lecture. So this event's sponsored by Design Media Arts, and then also co-sponsored by the UCLA Arts Software Studio, which is a group of graduate students who get together a few times every quarter to talk about areas of the visual arts, kind of in the larger sense of the UCLA Departments of Arts and Architecture, and people who are writing software as a part of their creative work. So with these two groups coming together, today we have the two books, 10 Print and Digital Humanities. I'm Casey Rees, and I'll introduce my team really quickly. We have three people from our team. We have Nick Montfort, who's joining us from MIT, and we have Mark Marino, who's joining us from USC.
Oh. Hi, I'm Peter Lunenfeld, also from Design Media Arts, and as you saw me spokesmodeling, this is our collaborative book, which is called Digital Humanities, and we have three of our authors of the four, besides me. And let me introduce them. Todd Pressner from German, who is also the chair of Digital Humanities here at UCLA. Then we have Johanna Drucker, who is the Breslauer Chair in Information Studies in GSEIS. And. I left out an and? All right. And Ann Burdick, who is the Chair of Media Design Practices, a set of graduate programs at Art Center College of Design.
Yeah.
So
Really quick. So I just want to give you a brief introduction to the program. So we're going to introduce each book in a sort of a short, quick conversation, and then once you have an idea of the groundwork of what we're going to be talking about, we'll then focus on the larger areas of talking about collaboration and scholarly production. So I think.
Can we use a Twitter hashtag of DHPrint?
Yeah.
No, we can't.
So if anybody's tweeting, as I will.
Hey, Mark, you need to use the microphone.
If anybody's tweeting, as I will, without ceasing, we're going to use DHPrint for the hashtag for this event.
we should do D_H.
I know, but it's hard to get the underscore.
I know,
It's,
all
you know,
right.
it's-
It should be
DH
like
print.
instead of a benediction,
Right.
before every event, we need to have someone stand and announce the hashtag. You know?
That,
But then after we have a conversation, hopefully we'll open up to the audience, and then we can have a dialogue back and forth. And Gareth has been so kind to set up this microphone over here as the platform for doing that.
we are streaming, so that's the reason that we try to insist on the microphones, so that the people who are watching out in the world don't just see like lips moving, but actually hear things, and that only happens if you speak into the microphone. I will go first. Essentially, a group of us had been interacting and talking with each other for years about the sort of discourses and practices and problems and remarkable opportunities that we saw available in a field that was coming to be named Digital Humanities. And we really wanted to do a book about that, and we were emphatic about wanting to do a book. And we can talk about, why do you still collaborate on books later. There was already an impetus at UCLA with the groundwork that had been laid to do an undergraduate minor and a graduate concentration in Digital Humanities. And so over the course of really a remarkably short time, we pulled together a team of like-minded people to develop a short, focused book about Digital Humanities that was going to emphasize something that we felt had not been emphasized enough, which was the absolute centrality of design to the emerging practices of the Digital Humanities. This meant bringing in a professional designer, Ann Burdick, who we had been working with. I'd done 3 print projects with Ann in the past and also had taught with her at Art Center, and she'd had extensive interactions with the other members of the team. So we had essentially people from really different disciplines and even different practices, but all devoted to this idea that we wanted to provide an in-depth examination of an emerging field. We sat down to write collaboratively, and part of what we'll be talking about is how do you do that, and what were our experiences. We tried a number of different platforms, none of which satisfied, especially not Google Docs. We started to round robin, and we found ourselves in a very interesting way creating not 5 different voices, but instead a choral voice, a combined voice that when I reread the book now, it's interesting because I think I wrote some of all of it and all of some of it, but I couldn't tell you how that broke down. This was, for me, a tremendous and exciting way of doing the things that I've been doing for 20 years. Okay, what were we talking about? We were looking at how to explore methodologies and techniques unfamiliar to traditional modes of humanistic inquiry, including geospatial analysis, data mining, corpus linguistics, visualization, and simulation. Each of us in our own practices did 1, 2, or 3 of those. None of us did all of them, but we really felt that we were able to cover a wide ground precisely because of the disparate nature of our practices and discourses. We really wanted to show the relevance of all of this for contemporary culture both within the academy, obviously, but also, and as important, if not more so, outside the academy. That was hugely important to us. How does this kind of work start to break down the boundaries between, hill and vale, between the cloister of the academy and the public discourses, which, here we are having to create a hashtag, right? That hashtag is going to be shared not only with people who are on the exact equal hierarchies of each of us in the university, grade and pay scale, but instead with people who don't know anything about that and live perfectly happy and happier lives because they don't. How do we do that? One of the things that we really wanted to do was to look at basics, at emerging methods and genres, and on what we called the social life of the digital humanities. Again, both social as in the way that we combine and bring things together as individuals and collaborative groups, but also how it functions within the world of social media, within society at large. We looked at creating case studies, what we called provocations and advisories, and these interventions were really designed as a kind of as a toolkit. I think we were very interested in Deleuzian notions of theory as a kit of parts and tools. We were interested in how history and criticism come together with various kinds of theory, and mostly how it then generates new forms of cultural production. That was a huge part of it. How do new modes of knowledge production function in the 21st century? How do they function within the collegiality of research colleagues? How do they function within the classroom? How do they function with citizen scholars? All of these things kind of combined. And I think that in the end, we argue that the digital humanities offer a revitalization of the liberal arts tradition in our electronically inflected, design-driven, multimedia, sort of speaking 21st century. So I hope that we can talk not only about the content, but also the method by which we created that today. And I'm just delighted that we're doing this with the 10 Print people.
All right, 10 Print. So Nick is going to do the introduction to our project.
So our book is titled 10 Print Char String 205.5 plus Rand 1. Go to 10. And its title is a computer program for the Commodore 64 in BASIC that produces the output that you see now. It's by 10 of us, myself, Patsy Bedouin, John Bell, Ian Bogust, Jeremy Douglas, Mark Marino, Michael Mateus, Casey Rees, Mark Sample, and Noah Vodder. And so we managed to produce a book that has a title and a list of authors that no one can remember. We also produced a book that's like Digital_Humanities. I kept telling these folks, you thought it was a challenge to get the underscore in that title. But like Digital_Humanities, it's a book that's available as a Creative Commons PDF. All the content is available online for free, but also made available conveniently. That's right. Peter doesn't want you to download, only upload. But we've made it available for people, and in our case, it's not just a general sense of interest in open access, which we have, but also specifically that the program that is the basis for this book was shared freely, and it was critical to its success and to the effect that it had on culture and other programs like it had on culture, that people could read it out of a magazine, type it in, share it with each other, even memorize it, and play with it and explore and create and start to understand what computation could do aesthetically and culturally through a single line like this. So we were very interested in focusing on the specifics of this program, but also connecting them to more general questions about computing and culture. And one of the things we do at the beginning of the book is to trace through different symbols, different keywords, why there's a 10 at the beginning of a line, why the word print occurs in the next position there, why there's a $sign. It's interesting that the computer sort of betraying its commercial heritage, right? It doesn't have a multiplication sign on the keyboard. I don't think anybody's computers in the audience do either, although we think of computers as being essentially calculating devices. But it does have a $sign, which is something I've, presenting about this in Mexico, people were particularly pleased to hear that the computer is marking itself as a commercial American device, or Estados Unidos device. So we try to trace through things on a token-by-token level, but also to look at other contexts of what it means to produce a pattern like this, which many people would call a maze, and many people have called a maze in print and otherwise, and how that sits with the rest of computing history, how it is that this pattern balances in certain ways between randomness and regularity. So it looks like a random pattern in a certain way, but really it has literally one bit of randomness in that it's only making one choice between a right-leaning and left-leaning diagonal line. The rest of it is a highly regular framework in which the output's occurring at a regular rate. The grid of characters that it's on, 40 by 25 grid, is regular. It's only choosing between two characters, not between every possible character that's there in the set. And its regularity in process is there as well, that it's executing the same statement again and again. So we looked at these things, both the randomness and regularity aspects, and at the Commodore 64 and the basic programming language to try to understand this. Now this came about as part of the Critical Code Studies workshop, not the most recent one, but the one prior to that Mark Marino hosted online. And I think he'll say some things about that, but this is initially a provocation that I put out. People were very interested in looking at, when they look at code, they want to look at things like, well, comments. Comments are great to look at because that's basically just like a text that we already understand. Or maybe we could look at variable names, right? Because there you have a free option given to the programmer to name things in different ways, and that might tell us something. And we want to look at big systems that do sort of provocative things that are obviously of cultural importance. And so in contrast to that, I put forward in an attitude of hopefully productive antagonism, this very simple program that doesn't even have an author that we know of. A biographical reading would be very difficult. Doesn't have any comments, doesn't have any variable names. But it does something that represents a whole area of practice in hobbyist programming that's very interesting and I think quite neglected. So that became a starting point for some discussion, and then for the book project. We'll hear more about the context of critical code studies overall, and perhaps about that workshop and the beginnings of our collaboration from Mark. We're glad to have Casey contributing as an author and writing a good portion of the book, as each of us chipped in to do, and also working as a designer and producing the material object, which we found a good way to communicate about the scholarly results that we had. And quite consistent with our concern for the material history of computing as well. We use emulators, and we used other means to access things about what the Commodore 64 experience was. But we also referred to this device right here and others like it to look how that came together. So we could say some about how the collaboration started, but I think I'll leave my collaborators to chime in on that, the means that we used, and hopefully we'll get to how this connects to the overall high-level Digital Humanities type of project, of which this is one instance.
So do we want to start? Let's go with Anne?
Yeah, let's go with Anne, and that would be.
You're live.
Hi, is it working? Can you hear me? Yeah? No? Can you, yeah? Okay, there we go, now it's going. All right, sorry, didn't hear myself. I think I was in a role in our collaboration with the Digital Humanities book that's similar to Casey's, in that I also participated as one of the writers, but I was also the person who actually chose the typefaces or composed the actual specific details of the pages. I'm sorry, obviously I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm afraid I can't speak very loudly. But one of the points I want to make, we have no design credit in the book, and we just basically have the 5 authors. And one of the key ideas that we're pursuing in the book is, again, the centrality of design, but also the project is the basic unit. And I think that it's important to understand that we conceived of this as a project, not as a book, a project whose form happened to be a book, which was decided in the process of conducting working on the project. And what I want to emphasize is that for a designer who is also someone who writes, and the bulk of my work is also collaborations with other writers, that gives me a kind of understanding of language and writing that's kind of working the material from the inside out. And I think that someone wrote an email to Johanna and I saying, why aren't more designers interested in the Digital Humanities? And I would say that the problem is that they teach typography and not language design. And I think that looking at the construction of arguments as a kind of designing is really a critical piece of the project that we did. And so what I just want to give you a feel for is, what does it mean to collaboratively design this book? Because I feel that we collaboratively designed this book. I also feel that we collaboratively wrote this book. So we had this famous for amongst ourselves weekend at the Harvard GSD that was this really, really amazing collaborative charrette weekend. And so this is what collaborative composition of a book looks like at the start of the weekend. And this is what it looked like at the end of the weekend. And basically what you see is us working through the ideas that comprise our argument, which was just going to turn into a book, which then in turn becomes the internal structure and rhythms of the book itself. So in my conception of what collaborative design is also collaborative writing, which I would call collaborative composition. Like, to me, the design of the book and the writing of the book were inseparable. They weren't separate activities where the writing was completed and then a designer came in and gave it a particular kind of face. So that's all I'm going to say for now. I'll pass it on to the rest. Who's next?
Oh, well, I'll follow up on some of those things. I mean, one of the interesting things that you don't see in the pictures that Anne showed you, of course, is the sounds that came from the room. And we were a very loud bunch. And we also were eating a lot and drinking a lot. And I mean, not alcohol, but we were there all day for 2 days. And people would stand, people would walk out, people would come in, and we would begin to really think. We were thinking as a group of 5 scholars, I guess, really about what the contours of the digital humanities might be. And so that also meant that we were thinking, what's the digital and what's the humanities, and what's the connecting piece between those two terms? And I think it's really interesting that we only figured out the title of this book at the very last moment, literally before we sent the darn thing to MIT. And we had gone through a lot of titles. You know, we were thinking of theory and practice, so the idea that theory is integrated into practice. We had been thinking about new knowledge. We had been thinking about a number of other titles we were playing with. At one point, we were just going to call it Digital Humanities, those 2 words, but without that yoke, without that linkage, right, without that underscore. And we had thought digital plus humanities. I think Anne had proposed at one point. We didn't like that. But when you put digital underscore humanities, somehow everything we had been talking about for the last really 2 or 3 years together made sense, which is it established a kind of precarious linkage between these 2 terms in which neither became absorbed in the other. So it wasn't just about the digital, and it wasn't just about the humanities, but it was what's at stake when you bring these 2 terms and their histories together, and then think about all the experimental and experiential processes that are built in. And so this was, for me, it really concretized the stakes of the book. Now, digital, we think of, I mean, just very briefly, I mean, kind of binary numeric form, right? The computational technologies, algorithmic processes that encode, present, distribute, analyze data. These are things ostensibly about disambiguation, right? Because the program needs to work. If you have an error in the code, it's not going to work. If you have an error in your database, you're going to get a null value, and that can be interpreted in lots of different ways. So this is what digital means. Humanities tends to be about things that relish in ambiguity, that are about subjectivity, they're about interpretation, and about making things ambiguous. And so at the very stake of the book is this kind of intersection between disambiguation and ambiguity, right? Between binary numeric form and multiplicity of interpretation. And it's all contained in that little underscore. So it's much more than just, you know, it references a whole way of us thinking nowadays, but that design moment where we thought about that linkage, it also was a real concretization of what's at stake in the book conceptually. So that's what I mainly wanted to say. But I will also say that there's a history of thinking through this within the digital humanities. I think actually Johanna's work with Spec Lab is a very important precedent for this book, where she proposes an idea, and you can talk more about this, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a notion of humanistic computing, right? So a notion of humanistic computing here is where it's not so much how the humanities have to be quote-unquote fixed by learning to think digitally, but what does humanistic or humanities thinking mean for the digital, right? So it changes the equation a lot. So what is it to think about ambiguity, to think about interpretation, positionality, subjectivity, all those things that are at stake in the humanities? How do those inflect computational thought? And that's, I think, what's at stake in humanities computing. It's also what's at stake, I think, in this real deep linkage between digital and humanities. So as much as the pictures, you know, evidence obviously a very rich collaborative thought, there's a lot more going on there, which is certainly the sounds, the yelling, the debating, and the whole history of what the inheritance of the humanities means for understanding our electronically inflected, computationally intense era. So I'll end there.
Should I go next? And shall we finish our book and then move back to your book?
Sounds good.
Okay. All righty. Well, thanks all of you for coming here, and I'll say that this was a tremendous experience, and thank you so much for having those slides, Anne. It's great to see that process. And I want to talk about a little bit about the technical aspects, the realistic aspects of collaborative work. I've collaborated with a lot of different people over the years in different ways, and collaboration is a term that I think we might want to put into a relationship with a couple of other terms that we want to define it in relationship to, and that would be if you have collaboration, you also have a notion of collectivity and the collective authorship. You also have an idea of a composite author, and you also have this idea of a kind of computational authorship. And all of these things, I think, are troubling many of the ways in which our notions of identity and subjectivity are attached to the production of texts and works. And I had occasion recently when I wrote a piece within a very different context, which is the poetry world, in which I described a bunch of the kind of collaborative works that are going on in the digital, electronic world and literary world. And I said, you know, this whole notion of the individual voice may be at an end. I mean, we may be at the end of the era of the individual voice. And this piece caused so much consternation that dozens of people, not named in the article, about whom nothing had been said, felt compelled to register their individual protest in very specific ways about all the things that had not been said about them, and when they were left unnamed. So so that sounds funny, but the fact is the anxiety about not being named is the anxiety of losing the individual voice as something that registers around identity, which in our culture is capital, which is celebrity, which is how, you know, we basically trade on what it is that we do as work. Now, I mean, that's cynical, but true. And so collaboration requires the willingness to actually give up some of that ownership of the capital of production with the idea that what we're doing is producing something we can afford as almost as a luxury as people in a particular place in our careers to do. So I think that's one of the things that it's interesting to think about. In terms of distinguishing these terms, I'd say that collaboration still engages us with the idea that we look at each other as individual persons whose contributions we respect. And that meant allowing each other to take different kinds of roles. We didn't march lockstep through this process with everybody doing the same work and the same amount of work for each task. We did understand that we had different strengths. Some among us are very good at quick drafting. Others are much better at editing and putting, you know, journalistic language into play. Others are better at careful editing and detail work. Others were better really at the kind of shaping and crafting and you know, that kind of design argument within the text and pulling that forward. So trusting each other's capabilities and saying, it's okay if you wrote 75% of that piece. It doesn't matter. We're going to go in now and work with it. And just like the rest of my authors, at the end of the process, we had said from the beginning, each of us must feel that any statement in the text is something we could stand by. So that if it were stated in a public place, why did you write X, Y, or Z, that we would feel okay saying, I wrote that. I feel accountable to and comfortable with that language. But as Peter said, I can't find my own language memes. You know, if I were to kind of tag the DNA of my own linguistic, compositional, stylistic trope, I would be hard-pressed to find the little molecular units of my linguistic fingerprint. So collaboration, I think, is premised on that kind of respect and trust that you're actually going to each pull your weight, but differently. It's that notion of difference. Collectivity, I think, is a different sensibility in which one actually loses, you know, there is a kind of absorption and alignment into a common project in a different sense. And then the composite notion, and here I'm thinking about some of the stuff you've written about, Nick, with some of the Michael Leong, and, you know, this kind of mashup work in which text is actually produced through, a set of moves and procedural activities that cannibalize an existing corpus while adding in a whole bunch of transformational activities to produce a new work. And so, again, very different kinds of approaches. All of these, I think, are, to me at least, signals of a kind of sea change in the way we do our work. And there will be implications for this in the way that we think about academic promotion and tenure, in the way in which we think about copyright and copy wrongs and copy left, and the ways in which we think about property and ownership and the production of our individual identity within the cultural sphere. So I think there's a lot of things going on, but it was a very productive and happy process process, I have to say. As I recall, we had no arguments. We had lots of discussion and debate, but there was, nobody got mad. There were no personal tensions among us. It was a very professional and engaged process that, anyway, I felt had a very positive outcome as well.
So I think one thing that's very interesting in listening to you talk right now is to recognize the similarities and differences between the two projects. I say we did have some good, some fights on our team. But I think that the two things that I think would be good for a print team to talk about now would be sort of first why 10 authors, and then how did that happen? Like how did we actually go about writing it with that large a number? So I think Nick is the best poised to talk about why that number of authors, and I think Mark is really good to talk about how the book emerged through the Critical Code Studies Forum, and then you were also the lead author on the first chapter too. But we didn't really know how to start, and so we just started. And through that first chapter, we made a lot of mistakes, and we did a lot of good things too. And then the rest of the book fell in after that first chapter started to be formed.
I think Mark is going to have a lot of the answer to why we ended up with the number of authors that we did. I mean, because it was through the Critical Code Studies workshop. I asked people about this line of code, what is there to say, and then I invited everyone on the thread to join us in writing a book. Some people weren't able to do it. Within that group, I looked to a few others who didn't respond and checked with them. But that was really the genesis for the project there, and seeing that there was some interesting conversation among a large group. I was interested to see if the sorts of collaborations that I've been involved with a smaller number of people could scale up that way.
I think also the idea that the nature of this book is that it's both technical and highly sort of social too. Mm-hmm. And I know for a fact that no one of us could have covered the breadth of material in the book, from the assembly code to talking about pick one of the many sort of topics that come out of humanities in the book. So for me, that was really the core reason to have a lot of authors or many voices in it.
I mean, yes. if you look at, I mean, to some extent, one way to look at these two book projects is that we had, 5 authors wrote about the digital humanities, but it took 10 authors to write about one line of code. And I find this to be instructive. So just a few initial comments. So this book project, Nick's interest in this line of code doesn't start with the Critical Code Studies Working Group. He had written about it previously in Matthew Fuller's collection, Software Studies Lexicon, and then I believe he'd presented on elsewhere as well. But in any case, when he brought it to the working group, as I've said elsewhere, I thought that it really was an act of sabotage rather than an act of productive provocation, but that's a personal tick of mine. But in any case, it presented critical code studies with some challenges that it had not faced head-on until then. Now, critical code studies, just to sort of bring everybody up to speed, was I guess a subfield of study that I had proposed in 2006 in an article in Electronic Book Review, and then subsequently written a few papers and conference presentations looking at different pieces of code. Again, much like Nick was saying, that all tended to be, I don't know if I'd say over-coded, but let's say works that in their own context had some sort of provocative edge to them to begin with in the work that they were doing. And then also had sufficient lines of code that there would at least be something to talk about, although, often a lot of points would hinge on 1 or 2 lines of code. That said, when we came across 10print, we had what appeared to be a purely aesthetic or maybe educational line of code, depending on how you look at it in a lot of ways. Something that didn't seem to have this large social dimension. Again, just by comparison, another piece of code that I had written about came from a prototype for software for a knowledge base that was used to track terrorists. And then subsequently, I've written code analyses of things like the electronic disturbance theater's transporter immigrant tool. So if you're familiar with that work, you can tell it's kind of touches upon hot button issues. Again, it's sort of easy to tease out things that maybe other people might engage with already, and then you sort of trace those out through the code. But here we had just what seemed to be, again, it's always deceptive, pure code, and we had to do some semiotic analysis. And there was a question about where we were going to go. That said, up until that point, a divide had become clear to me. I mean, the two worlds divide had become sort of caricatured in my head, that there were these people who were working to make code unambiguous and make it operate and make it function and make it execute, and there were these other people who we were doing our interpretive best to search to relish in ambiguity. I like Todd's line there. And so Nick had basically assembled people from both camps, if such camps even exist. And we had to begin that conversation as we did, not only in the working group, but also on a listserv that Nick set up early on, that we have to this day. We still discuss things, and although most of the time we're reacting to people who are reviewing this book. But as a result of this collaboration and having people from, an uncommon bipartisanship amongst people within the digital humanities for this particular project, the book was peer-reviewed before it was peer-reviewed, right? I mean, our toughest critics were our co-authors. So I found that to be interesting. The other thing that was really instructive to me about this process was that, again, Nick is exactly right. The easy hooks were gone. There wasn't natural language other than the word print and GOTO. I guess that's natural language. There weren't large comments. There weren't sections that were that could have been written 1,700 different ways in 14 different languages in ways that were really all that interesting to me at first. And then I guess I started to come to know the process of interpreting this code differently, that it wasn't we were going to open this thing up and find the secret and reveal it to people, but the line of code itself was going to be the entry point to a discussion of platforms, software, and then especially culture. And so as we, even in that introduction, as we pursue each token of the code and sort of ask questions like 10, I mean, again, you ask sort of beginner questions, why 10, right? Why is this even, do we even need this line number? A lot of our contemporary programming languages don't have them. Why isn't it 5, right? Again, I tend to, because I'm not a programmer, I tend to always ask these beginner questions, which again, I find productive for inquiry, but of course my heavily programming friends find highly annoying. And then the only other thing I want to comment on, so again, I came to understand critical code studies, again, might be something where the line of code is the entry point to the discussion rather than the line of inquiry leads you to the secrets, the decoded code. And then the other thing I want to mention too is, as a writing instructor, when we decided that we were going to compose this book all on not a Google Doc, but a wiki with one voice, again, somebody, like I spend my time trying to help my students develop these sort of like personal voices that they want to use at various times. And then thinking about what would happen if we all tried to do this together given our different styles. I almost stopped entirely. It seemed completely impossible, unlikely, foolhardy to attempt. And then, of course, our process of writing the book, I was called the chapter owner, the choner of the Maze chapter, which was one of the first ones we wrote. And then there was a core group of us that had worked heavily on that chapter, in particular, Patsy, Mark, Jeremy, and then, again, other people tagged in and out. Hopefully they'll chime in over Twitter if I'm leaving anybody out from that initial core group. And we went from including everything about mazes that you could possibly think of to feeling like we shouldn't include anything about mazes because, to be quite honest, I was talking to this with an uncle of mine recently who's a designer, and he said, what you have there is not a maze. Why are you talking about it as though why do you have an entire chapter about mazes? Anyway, Nick may have
I wanted to, but I think Michael Mateus had the best answer to that in the book, which is the final remark. The book is structured in 5 chapters, which are about these higher level topics, and remarks using the RIM statement that are around them that are about more specific things related to programs. And the last of these, which Michael Mateus spearheaded, was a program that is a 65-line basic program, as it's finally presented in the book, which operationalizes the display and actually determines whether or not there is a path from the left side to the right side and tells you whether it's a maze or not. which it is in some cases, depending upon the screen that gets generated, and it's not in others. So this question, instead of being used as a way to dismiss the topic, is something that opens up to, well, maybe that's the digital answer, the digital binary deterministic answer to the ambiguous, hesitational utterance of the humanist. But but it's something like that. It's part of it. At least it's a dialogue that's happening there.
And in many ways, again, not just to just tag on to that, that program doesn't find its way through the maze. It turns the output of that program into a maze. And again, that's where the creative, critical work of creative computing mixes with this, these other hermeneutics.
I think that's a really essential part of our process for the book, which isn't directly related to, well, it is related to the collaboration on our team, is that we weren't able to determine what was really unique to this program and to the basic language and to the Commodore 64, and so we started, until we started to write other versions of the program. Yep. So writing versions in other computer languages like Perl and processing yeah. and many other languages, and that's really what a lot of I think our best ideas about the analysis of the program came out of generating new media as a way of reflecting on this original media that we had. Mm-hmm. I want to say one more thing about our process just really quick. Yeah. Different from the Digital_Humanities process, with our 10 authors, we were never able to meet in person. And to this day, I think there's 5 of our authors that I've not yet met in person. And so we did everything online and a few in-person meetings. And so in order to sort of generate the first content for the book, we had a deadline where everybody had to write 2,000 words on what they thought the book should be about. And that's how everything started. I think some of those things didn't make it into the book, and some of them
hated
became
that.
core chapters. I thought it made perfect sense.
But I was like, look, just write this, because if you really care about it, if that's really important, there's probably going to be something in there that's going to go into the book eventually. And some people, Casey was nice. Other people were like, what do you mean? What do you mean just write about whatever I want to? I want an assignment.
So then also, sorry. So everything happened, everything happened online through these really large open Skype channels where everybody's talking at the same time over each other. The wiki was really the core tool that we used. And for me, this is really normal, working on processing for the last decade with collaborators around the world. Many of those people I've still never met. This was just taking that natural way of working on a large open source software project and moving it into this direction. I thought it worked extremely well.
I wanted to start switching over to some Q&A format now, if that's all right. And I'll start by asking some questions, and then you guys chime in, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience fairly soon. But I wanted to start by just mentioning a title of a book by an Australian art historian named Charles Green. And it's called The Third Hand. And it's his analysis of artists' teams like Gilbert and George, Art and Language, or architects like Diller and Scofidio. And this notion of the development of a third hand. And part of those teams is that they have a great deal of equality within them. And when I think about one of the major differences between Digital Humanities and 10 Print, Digital Humanities was written by 5 people who knew each other pretty well, who were all, again, I brought up that kind of hierarchy. We're all sort of on an equal hierarchy, the equivalent of tenured full professors who could risk various kinds of things, who had enough in their background.
If we still remember how.
Right. Exactly. But I bring this up because one of the interesting things about your book, about 10 Print, is that there's people from all over that hierarchical grid and from off that grid, which strikes me as something that's really interesting, but how does that function? Anybody, Mark? Yeah.
Well, I hold an interesting position within that grid. But I think it begins with the Critical Code Studies Working Group in that, so that was convened in 2010. We used a online platform, a Ning for it, And we had about over 100 participants who were varying levels of experience and tenure, and everyone from full professors to an undergraduate, Max Feinstein, who was working with me at the time to try to put it together. And what I found was it took that diverse a group of people. Again, we weren't, it wasn't a question of what your credentials were. It was a question of all these little, not just micro levels of expertise, but also where their inspiration came from. And so as people would go out the course of that 6-week working group and posted individual lines of code and would invite other people to come comment on them, I, as an organizer, just couldn't predict who could offer something that would be productive. Would it be the people who knew about theory? Would it be the people who knew about code? Or would it be somebody who's a mix of those things all together? And so, so starting from that framework, when we reached the book project and we had a similar group, again, it wasn't a question of, has this person finished their dissertation yet? It was a question of, what can they contribute? And that was really important to us.
It's also not that none of us knew each other. I mean, we did have a lot of social connections within the group, and sort of there were threads connecting us very well. So there was a lot of existing knowledge and discussion leading into it. Just that, yeah.
I mean, one of the ways, I guess, one of the things I often compare to the book project of Tinprint is an edited collection. And these edited collections, they can sometimes be provocative conceptually. They can sometimes have interesting articles in them. In my experience, they're seldom like the best, most influential books in a field. I mean, that's really not where it's actually not what makes the biggest difference intellectually.
Except for the one that you did.
Well, I didn't. Rounding up authors and asking them to write things wasn't part of that. But that was done. The influence was done already.
Lots of them were dead.
We just stapled it together. And so it's a process of where you're going to round up the usual suspects. You're going to everybody's going to go to their library carols and work on their little article. They'll communicate through the scholarly record, but not with each other as they write. And then, the editorial function seems to be, maybe it's just a function of my participation in these volumes, but it seems to be just like chiding people for being late and bothering them to turn their stuff in, and things like this. And so what do you expect from, from a process like this? Why not get people together who may not be a more sort of non-hierarchical or more unusual sort of collection of people than you'd see in an edited volume, but have them work together and have them collaborate together and have them do the work of making something that's a coherent book-length argument. So that's part of the idea.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about one of the key audiences for our book. Now, there's multiple audiences, but one audience in particular that we were concerned with was how to, I think, communicate to many of our senior colleagues, chairs, provosts, and other people who hold a lot of power at the university in terms of hiring and what disciplines and departments are going to survive, communicate to them what the transformation that is the digital humanities might mean for their departments, schools, disciplines, and also how it might influence future hiring practices and how it might provide some tools and some resources for evaluating junior candidates who are not yet tenured, or even grad students who are proposing different ways of thinking about their intellectual work and different ways of conceiving of what their contribution to the field would look like. And so it's true that we were made up of all full professors, all of whom have various chair positions. But the idea was really to, again, it's not the only audience, but one was to speak to those departmental chairs, those deans, those provosts, and even offer some very practical things like how to evaluate digital scholarship for committees that are evaluating professors, for tenure, and to provide a rigorous theorization of that field. And I would also say, if I look at where the accent falls on this digital humanities, I certainly didn't want to conceive of this as a binary by any means, but there's lots of overlap and productive overlap. But the accent perhaps is placed on the humanities. And that accent, and this is also a book about not the death of the humanities, the end of the humanities, all these banalities about how we no longer are doing humanities, but really what's at stake at doing the humanities now and here at this moment in time and why it's so significant. So in many ways, it's truly, I wouldn't quite go so far as to say it's a celebration of the humanities, but it's certainly of the vitality of the humanities at this moment. And that had to speak to a lot of audiences. And this audience at the high levels, as well as the undergrad who's considering majoring in digital humanities, it also had to be appealing, at that level. So.
Well, that was one of the primary reasons why we made it a book, and as opposed to another kind of project or medium.
So I asked Peter if I could ask a question, and I wanted to think about some of the points of commonality among our projects and also the context in which we're sitting here, and that has come back to this issue of design, and to think about design and practice. And when I hear you describing the way in which you took that line of code and rewrote it in various kinds of programs, and that we wouldn't commonly think of that as a design practice, but to me that's a design practice. In other words, it's an iterative process of taking something that has a specific form in a particular medium, and then using the activity of reworking it in according to certain kinds of rules and constraints and formal investigations to see what it is, to see how you understand it. And it sounds so similar to me to what I hear when Anne says writing from the inside out, where you get inside of the project and begin to think through the form, the intellectual model, your understanding of it through a set of engagements that are theoretically informed but practically enabled. And so I guess I want to raise the question of how we might communicate more broadly a role for design and an understanding of it, particularly for disciplines where it's traditionally not present. And again, within the digital humanities, certainly for humanists, design always sounded to them like accessorizing, like you do all your work, you get finished, and then you bring in a designer to give you some style. And it's like, hello, okay, so, this is hopeless. You can't get style at the end, as I know. So, you gotta be there from the beginning. But anyway, the equation of design and style is, of course, one of the problems here. And we really are interested in design as a way of thinking intellectually, creatively, iteratively as a practice. So I just wanted to throw that back for discussion is, how do we create an understanding of design that has a graspable, tractable set of principles to it that communicate vividly to audiences and constituencies in ways that also, when I look out at our younger colleagues, the next generation, give them a role to play in a way that has legitimacy and authority within diverse disciplines as well. So it's a lot of questions, but you know where I'm going.
Yeah, it's very similar to the questions that I ask about programming, which is a way of designing computation, so no surprise. But you can, of course, if you teach design as a stylistic sort of fix-up, if you present the problems of legibility and distinctive appearance and things like this, rather than talking about it as a method of inquiry, then well, what should one expect? Obviously, people are going to treat it that way instead of another. And similarly for programming, if you're trying to say we can package up PHP, JavaScript, slick website of a certain type as a final step for your several weeks long, semester long brainstorming process, and so on, rather than using programming as a way to think about the problem to begin with, right? Then you end up in the same place, not really seeing the fundamental possibilities for engaging with these. So my answer in the case of programming is to look at a very small scale programs, ways that people can modify and augment and learn from these, sketching and exploring in different ways, and showing that it is possible to think through programming. The question of then hooking it up to something larger scale may not be straightforward, but it should be possible because you've understood from the beginning that programming is a method of inquiry rather than just a type of window dressing or text console dressing, depending upon the type of programming you're doing. Yeah.
Okay. No, I just wanted to advocate for the idea of the designer being an entire author of the book and also getting equal credit for the author of the book too. like a book that we did prior to this one also had that criteria. So as far as I know, sort of this small set of books, and then there's, of course, historical precedent. Jeffrey Schnapf, who's one of the authors of Digital Humanities, wrote an entire book about Quentin Fiore and Marshall McLuhan's collaborations together. And sort of I'm of the strong opinion that for a certain kind of book, that voice needs to be there, of course, at the very beginning. And that's how we aspire to teach our students here. Yes, so in terms of the 10-print book, there's a lot of, I would say, subtle visual information in the book that I think is directly related to the same kinds of scholarship that went into the development of the text. For example, the visual experience of sort of moving through the book. The book itself is based on the original Commodore 64 user manual, which is the place where this program first originated. This sort of a similar kind of like font and sort of the way the layout is generated is built on the experience of reading the original user manual. And so there's a lot of these encodings in there. And I'm also of the opinion that sort of the visual curation of the book, like which images to use, of like all the images we could select for this book, we selected these, is another part of the process of authoring the experience. And I think every book can be read, or should be able to be read sort of as a visual experience as well, moving through, as well as the text and images. So that curation of images was equally, I think, a part of the process of constructing this book.
Can I jump in there? So as someone who's not in the design world, I remember one of the early ways that I tried to approach the program was to say, I'm always wary of these arguments of like media exceptionalism for technological advances in the 21st century or late 20th century. And so I remember asking the question early on, who else would have had the knowledge that this program would do what it does, right? And so pretty quickly I came across the idea of, anybody who is practiced in the art of, ornamentation through speaking of ornamentation, through patterns, right? Anybody who would know the repetition of this pattern would aggregate in such a way. So that's when we quickly started to turn into other design books where that pattern existed, other cultures where we would find that pattern proving itself. And again, I feel like that is a critical paradigm that I don't have coming to it as a literary digital humanist. But when I mentioned this uncle, this uncle also builds motorcycles, and he just happens to be extremely visually oriented. And so when he looked at the initial pattern for 10-print, he said, well, I could have predicted that was the output. And again, for a lot of people, the joy or the surprise of this program is that image on the screen is not what they would have predicted. So so we looked into textiles, we looked into, again, people who design borders, other sorts of things where people had already long theorized the repetition of patterns. Again, a world that was entirely new to me that I had to heavily rely on Casey for.
Well, I think that at the heart of this question is what constitutes knowledge, and that's what we, the book is sort of, our particular book is getting toward, and making as a way of knowing about the world is a huge piece of designing our programming, as inquiry. And I think that a lot of makers don't necessarily see their work as research or as inquiry. And I think that to shift that orientation allows you to get to pretty interesting places. But then the question is, how is that knowledge manifest and transferred and recognized as a kind of knowing? And at the moment, the models we have are writing, right? I mean, that's the sort of thing. And until, it kind of begs the question if the knowledge that I gain through the working and reworking of the language of our book, or the knowledge that Casey might learn through the working and reworking of the programming of this line of code, has to have a way to be shared, and a form for that to take, for it to be something more than just my own personal development. And so to me, it's kind of a question of what form will knowledge production take that is accessible. We're all taught to teach to write from the moment we, with overactive parents, from the time we're like, 6 months old. But we're not taught to design and not taught to recognize that the making of things is a mode of understanding of the world. So, unless you went to Montessori.
Let me just, one quick comment on that, Anne, before Peter's going to open it to the floor, and that is to say that, as somebody who studies the history of visual epistemology, right, a term not used in the academy very much, we could look at the history of graphical means of knowledge production and dissemination, and they would be architectural manuals, they would be studies of morphology, they would be things like the great pattern books of the Middle Ages, they would be things like Owen Jones's, monumental grammar of ornament, and all of the legacy of the languages of form that come into codification in the 20th century. So there are many, many precedents for thinking about that. But again, it's not been well integrated into the humanities or into, we know it in the design world. We know those works, we know those precedents. But again, the authority, giving authority to that as a form of knowledge has been very slow. It's like it's seen as trade, it's seen as craft, or it's seen as a separate professional discipline.
Nick, I was just thinking it would be great to open the floor to questions, another mode of knowing. So the microphone is so lonely over there.
So there'll be time for Nick's comment.
Can you grab it and walk it around, Noah, or just thanks?
It's a
Oh,
wired
it's
mic.
Or you could just walk over and get in line.
Yeah. Have we got the yeah, let's use the hand mic too. Yeah.
This one?
Yeah. Hi, we have someone.
Wait, I disagree.
Gareth really wanted to innovate this new system for us today.
Hello?
Oh,
Just
did he?
defeated his.
I'm sorry, Gareth.
Thank you. So I have a two-part question. The first part is, what patterns did you identify in the collaboration process itself? So you were talking about patterns. And then the second is, how much do you think you can systematically design for the integration or reconciliation of ideas? And how much does that stay kind of mysterious or intuitive?
Well, I think I understand the question, the first one. So in the end, through writing a number of chapters, we ended up with a process where not all 10 people would write every chapter. We'd have 2 or 3 people really as a core team would write the majority of it, and then if 2 more people often would come in and do the first edit on it, and then someone else would then come in and then sort of smooth the consistency sort of across things. So that was a structure that we put in place that worked well by the end of the book. And then we had these other remark chapters, which every other one, those were mostly spearheaded by an individual, and then 1 or 2 other people would come in and also work on those as well.
Do we have? Oh, I think she was. Sorry.
So my question is about the collaboration aspect of your project, and kind of thinking about how when you bring different elements together, there's either this sharpening that takes place or this dulling. Like if you think about river rocks kind of dulling each other down, or maybe a knife against a knife sharpener. So what I'm wondering is, do you guys think anything was lost, any voice or poignancy was lost as you started collaborating? You said you wanted to stand behind every word, but I'm just wondering how you took 10 great thinkers and found some common ground without losing something strong.
Well, apparently by how quickly I grabbed for the microphone, I think something was lost. Well, again, I do believe our book was peer-reviewed before it was peer-reviewed. I do think that if any half of us had written the book, it would look very different. I think, again, a few of us, Mark Sample, Patsy, myself, again, not to sort of set it up into these sort of teams of players, but
you are.
but I am, which would not be uncommon for me to try to do both. But anyway, was that we had a very, our orientation was toward symbolic interpretation and the social. And I think that there were definitely avenues of the social, the critical, the countercultural, that I think that perhaps I didn't always propose knowing that it was not necessarily the tenor of our particular conversation or the interest or the direction we were heading in. That said, I mean, I'm sure if I'd written the pages, Nick would have been really happy to at least have us all consider them, you know? So nothing was left out of the conversation in that sense. But I think maybe there's a little, when you collaborate, once we established common ground through a bit of an agonistic struggle, I think maybe it's not that we were so beaten up we didn't bring up new ideas, but we had a sense of, a little more sense of shared mission, or what we at least valued as productive when approaching this. We could at least, our common ground for what would be productive when discussing this particular program. That was my experience, at least.
Yeah, just a couple of words. It's a great question, and I think that I'd have to actually look back at probably these pictures that Anne snapped during our charrettes to see what really didn't get hashed out extensively in the book. I think, you know, in the conversations that we had, things, the debate that happened was certain things would rise to the top and other things would kind of, you know, get ranked lower. And we had to decide, you know, is this going to be for a full essay? So like the social life of the digital humanities at one point became a full-length kind of essayistic thing, although chunked up. I mean, so none of the essays are really full form. They're really composed of lots of short forms. But then we had other kinds of writing that also materialized, like the provocations and the paradoxes, which is the last bit where we actually, you know, we engage with contradiction and alternatives, right? So even beginning that part with the era of the digital humanities may be coming to an end, right? So there's a book about the digital humanities, and then we say, oh, it's done, you know? And so there's this idea of beginning to even imagine other ways of, you know, within the book, there's certain ways of it speaking against certain things, even though all of us stand behind both speaking for and speaking against. And then you have other kinds of writing as well here, like sample projects, the how-tos, which are really practical, even checklists, right? And so we thought through a lot of different ways of presenting things, and you know, there might have been other checklists that we created. That's true. And I think there might have been other, maybe other things that may have been equally deserving of a long-form discussion. But the pieces that we eventually chose were the ones, I think, after a lot of debate, were the ones that seemed to be the most compelling for us to understand where the digital humanities is at this moment in time. You know, it'd be interesting to imagine a follow-up of the book.
Can you pass the microphone over to Victoria? Oh.
I think just one other thing on that question, super quick, is that I think in both books we developed different kinds of text within the book in order to share different kinds of voices. So in our book we have the primary general chapters as well as the remarks, which are more single voiced, but then we also have a lot of sidebars because there were other things people sort of wanted to put in and maybe we didn't think was essential to the whole thing. So we tried to play it both ways, and this is the result.
First, I want to congratulate all of you for actually producing these books. It's kind of like having a faculty meeting where you're supposed to come up with something tangible. I'm really impressed. I'm sure each one of you will want to have a little time to yourself to do your own project after this experience, because it's all collaborative in a way. But what I'm very, very curious about, and what you didn't address, is distribution. How do you distribute this? Is it going to be on demand? Is it going to be online? Who's going to be in charge of that? I heard it's free, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be work to produce and distribute, update. Is it done, or is this a continuing project? Where are you taking it from here?
Did you guys want to go first?
Yeah, it's done. So, you know,
Yeah,
I mean.
but that said, I spent a significant amount of my winter holiday doing typesetting corrections.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, as much as, you know, as much as books are. So, but yeah, I guess it's free to read. Is that the phrase? Like free to play. We have the PDFs online, but the books are also available, which I don't know. I mean,
So how? I mean, when you say online, is it? Where is it? Where's the server?
Tinprint.org, 10print.org.
Okay.
It's room 14
Can you
and 233 at MIT.
I mean,
That's where the server is.
I'm actually very curious about this, because I think this stage is a lot of time neglected or not explained enough. And I'm very curious in relation to particularly this kind of very collaborative project. where there could be thousands or millions distributed, right? How do you do it? Who's in charge of it? Which server is it on? Is it print on demand? Is it ebook? What if somebody approaches you from Audible or whatever, wants to create another piece? Very possible. How are you addressing these issues?
Let me just mention one way in which we've addressed them, which is to, one of the things I don't normally do is ask the press that I publish with to take copyright of a book. I usually prefer to keep my own copyright.
So who has the copyright on
In this
this?
case, MIT Press, because trying to arrange with 10 of us to do anything is going to mean that nothing can ever be done. And we wanted, we did want, yeah,
So
besides,
MIT Press has the copyright,
yeah.
but it's free.
But it's a Creative Commons share-alike license.
Right.
Yeah.
And explain that more, because I'm very interested
Sure.
in
Well, I
this.
mean, so the Creative Commons license.
No, I think, yeah. But you're pointing at me, and I don't know why.
Well,
You spend more
because
time
your book
with
is CC also. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different flavors of that license, and ours is that it can actually be adapted and then sort of re-put out. It's a pretty liberal license. And so one thing we did at the very beginning was to sort of post sort of the announcement on a number of different forums and started conversations there. So a lot of the different major places where conversations are going on, like Slashdot and Boing Boing and what are some of the other lists.
Yeah.
And so that like drove people to
Slate, Hacker News, there were, yeah, we could,
Yeah.
there were a bunch of them, 10 or 12 of the
So
major
that led
places.
people to 10print.org, which is the URL that we secured for distributing the book. And then there's just a PDF download, which is pretty straightforward. And actually, one thing that none of my co-authors know about yet is that I'm working on a Mobi and also an HTML5, like a web version too, that I'm going to show them this afternoon. So that'll make it even easier to
Yeah.
distribute and to be out there for different formats.
We so liked what they did that we just took their Creative Commons license and slapped it on ours without really thinking that much about it, because we figured if Casey and these guys had thought about it, we'd outsource that. But no, I mean, we wanted something quite similar. We were with the same press, with MIT. They're trying to figure out how to keep academic long-form publishing alive in an era in which more and more people seem to want to have both hard copy books, and both of these books I think are really beautiful objects, and they were designed to be beautiful objects as books. And then we both put them out as PDFs.
How do I get this book?
From bookstores and
Amazon.
order it from Amazon. MIT, it's an MIT Press book. It's the
And so
same-
how much is it?
20, what?
You don't know?
Before the discount is $24.95. If you go to Amazon, you get 30% off.
Yeah,
And if you go to MIT, I think you get 30% off.
yeah, it's
And then
it's under
how is
20
the
bucks.
royalty shared between you guys?
Oh, no.
Totally
Eh,
got it.
okay, they have a different.
We argued about these things
right?
for
Yeah,
months.
yeah.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
No. Well, okay,
It's really important issues.
no, I think, why don't you guys talk about how you guys did it,
Yeah.
which was quite unusual.
You know, I mean, one thing we did, which is I think, the conservative move, is we went with an established academic press, MIT Press. And so it's published on paper using offset printing and like a normal publishing way.
Which, by the way, I have to say, like, we didn't start off saying, this is a project, will it be a book or not? No, we knew it would be a book, and that, I think, was important to gathering a group of people who wanted to write a book together. And if, in fact, people buy the arguments in your book and think that doing a project is just as compelling from an academic standpoint, then maybe we could do something else in the future. But we did it that way for that reason.
Yeah, and because we have 10 authors, the share of academic book royalties with 10 authors is not going to be a large amount of money. And so we're donating all of ours to a nonprofit, which is the Electronic Literature Organization, the ELO.
And
We-
how many
yeah.
did you publish?
Well,
What's the
actually,
run?
our first run was, I think, about 1,500, and we sold out of that within like a week or two. And so we're already on our third printing.
How many downloads? I
We
think
don't-
I think it was higher. I haven't looked at the downloads since a week after it was at 40,000.
Yeah. We, yeah. No, we actually,
Yeah.
we also outsourced without meaning to all of our publicity to Lev Manovich, who literally put it out on his software studies list, and it was last month, his announcement about the publication of our book was the second highest retweeted tweet that contained the words digital and humanities in it. It was incredible how much that is. We don't have it on our server. It's actually on the same page as ordering the book from MIT. So you go to the MIT Press website and you can just hit a button and you get the PDF. We've already had one complaint from someone that our free shit isn't good enough for them. They like the Matthew Gold reworked Digital Humanities reader. Somebody said, well, compared our PDF to that and said, how come they didn't work harder on their free version? To which I would say, because our royalties for the Ferrari haven't come in yet. But once I can, really come to campus in style in my Ferrari from the royalties from this book.
And so why didn't you or MIT go on to print on demand? Because you could have made $40,000 easily by charging $1 a book or something like that.
I doubt it.
No, I'm just curious.
For our strategy,
yeah.
we really wanted to have,
sake.
we wanted to have, whether we succeed or not is open to question, but we wanted to have a beautiful object that people wanted to have. We wanted to have a really rich reading experience. And so print on demand is not,
Sure.
it's not high enough quality yet.
No, that's not true. I'm sorry. I have to actually disagree with you. Print on demand can produce just as good of an object if the design and so forth are chosen. The paper choices for print on demand are harder to guarantee. Okay, so the paper's important, but the backlog inventory of most academic presses is going to move to an on-demand, download. But it's just that the initial distribution still, academic libraries and bookstores and academic trade fairs, the MLA, the CAA, whatever, those are still major venues for the launch of a work. I mean, people come to the booths, they see the book, they pick it up, they want it, they take it away. So the distribution still has that kind of, full presence aspect to it, as well as, we know people download PDFs and then they buy books. Because, so.
MIT Press has the type of organization that it is, right? They have 40 people whose job is to go to bookstores. They're booksellers throughout the U.S. and the world.
No, but even if you,
Other questions?
yeah.
Yeah. But then also with the economics of on-demand printing is that if you're printing over a certain volume of thousands, it's actually cheaper to do offset traditional printing. Yeah.
The per unit cost at there's a break point on a per unit cost for setup for offset printing, especially if it's done in the Far East.
I mean, especially hardcover. I mean, that's something to, I've done both, so.
You had a question?
Yeah.
And
Hi.
you had a question?
Is this one working? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you all. I had a quick question about process. Dr. Lunefeld mentioned that Google Docs was not good enough. I was wondering what the disadvantages to that were and what are the advantages of, is it round robin you said? I had never heard of that.
I know, round robin is,
As a
there was
concept.
email.
I
It's another way to
So
put it.
instead of
We
Google
would write
Docs.
something, basically we tried to do it with a variety of kind of wiki or open docs. But we didn't feel, we felt that it was truly getting beyond us, and that and instead of this kind of chapter owner, okay, instead of that, what we did was we just sort of gave people a basic lead on a whole or usually a part of a chapter, go write it, then it would be sent around, and it would literally be sent person to person, and it wasn't an editing so much as an augmentation process. So you'd start with, alpha, and then you'd move to a beta, and then through and through until what we ended up with became the new alpha, and then it would go around again later. And so I think that might have been impossible with 10. It was hard enough with 5.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote my previous book, Racing the Beam, collaboratively with Ian Bogus, and we used Markdown to write just plain text files. And we would go on IM and just throw paragraphs back and forth there. You try to do that with Word, it will be problematic because of formatting issues. But,
Right.
so I sort of like to keep free and open, fairly simple in terms of things. So mailing list and media wiki were the basic technologies for tin print.
Although for the much contested Maze chapter, we did actually use Google Docs. And we've also, the other thing I just want to point out, just for anybody who's interested in doing these kinds of projects, we eventually realized we had to have weekly meetings that were both Skype and in the Google Doc to work on that particular chapter. And that having that kind of, I mean, again, it's more about herding cats and getting us to do the work that we had committed to doing. But we did find that that kind of regular return to the writing helped us to make the first real progress. I just want to mention this. There is a question that's been sent to us via Twitter. If we're, I don't know if we're ready for it yet.
I wanted to say one more thing about this topic, very quickly. The wiki worked really well for us, but at times it has. I'll mention two problems. Like one is that it's just not as fluid as working locally often. So we would lock a chapter, and then people would work on that offline and then put it back in. The other thing is wiki software is not, in my opinion, elegant enough at showing you the changes. It's really kind of difficult to do that. So like say for example, I write a paragraph that I think is great. A month later, it's missing. Like who removed that? And so you spend like 20 minutes going down through the wiki to find that like Nick happened to remove that like 2 weeks ago and didn't write a reason why you removed it or something like that. So wiki software worked well for us, but it was far from ideal.
Did you prefer Google Docs?
No, we needed, I think, to use wiki because of the good version control. The interface for getting to it needs to improve.
But there's no alternative that
We didn't find it.
because I agree with you. So
Chris, and a Twitter question,
Yeah.
I think.
And Anne has something she would.
and you
No, it's okay. We've got other questions coming.
Mark, do you want to do the
How mu-
Twitter
It was
question
my
or
love
then
of
Chris?
Google Docs.
Okay. Yeah, I know. I love it as well. All right. So this question comes to us from Marianne Breeze, who some of us know as Mez, the developer of Mezengel. So partly I want to share her question because of the novelty of someone from Australia asking us a question. But in any case, she wrote to us back in an earlier section. She says, humanities reworked with design principles in mind. Shouldn't user experience be an instrumental concern? And I asked her to elaborate, and she wrote, just making the point, asking the questions, if user experience should be heavily considered integrated rather than considered as a background. And again, she asked this thinking through her own process of constructing Mezengel, which is a code-inflected Creole that's in between a programming language and a natural language that she's developed. So.
In the notes that I had for talking today, I was, one of the things I was going to talk about in terms of composing the book and giving shape to an argument was also the idea of creating an experience for the reader and creating a tool for a user. So to shift by this user experience question to look at a book as an interface for knowledge and what is the graphical user interface and, how does one navigate it? This, actually one of the best random access objects we have. For me as a designer, it completely changes the way I think about these, what are units of knowledge. I do think that the thing that design brings to all of this is the consideration, or is various constructions of people that can be useful, and some that aren't. I mean, it's missing a lot of really good ones as well, but we tend to think of, there's, whether it's a reader, a user, a viewer, an audience, a market, I mean, there's all these different constructions of people who we imagine on the other end of what we're making. By we, I mean writers, humanists, designers, et cetera. And I actually think that a lot more work, I don't think user experience is necessarily a great model. I think it's really anchored in a lot of HCI ideas about people that have a kind of empiricist kind of thing I'm not a fan of. But it misses a lot of the interpretive dimensions that the humanities kind of critique brings. But I do think this question of who we conceive on the other end of what we're making is a huge question, and I think Digital Humanities is in a great position to push that further. And design can contribute, but I don't think it has the answers.
Let's have two more questions. We've got Chris, and then
Well, this
yeah.
this question relates directly to the last, so I'm very thankful that it appeared. And it's very short. That is, you spend a lot of time talking about the integral importance of design in communicating the argument that's made in the book. It's sort of implicit and explicit in both of these in some ways. Do the reviews and the responses to these publications address that explicitly? And this may be, there may be two different answers to this from the two different groups, but I'm thinking of the reviews I've seen of Digital Humanities _ don't talk about the inextricable connection of the design of the artifact to the argument. And this to me seems to be very important because it's taken up so much of our time today. And I'd like to hear, one, whether you've had that, and two, whether this is something that as authors you need to put out a call for that kind of review as well.
I mean, I can answer, having had extensive experience producing books with designers, releasing them to the world, and having them reviewed as though somebody had pressed a print button. And that comes mostly from academic humanists, and it's like, do you not have eyes at all? But that's just my own rage problems, and I'll work on that by myself. But I think that, yes, I've put out personally, a plea to all of the design critics who are always saying, oh, why isn't design discourse more interesting? Why can't we deal with actual issues rather than just endlessly, masturbating about fonts? And the answer is, because you spend so much time endlessly masturbating about fonts and talking about that, why don't you, here's something where we're trying to use fonts and we're trying to use design to actually, augment knowledge and our argument. So right now, it is out with people who I'm hoping will be able to talk about that from the design perspective. As for those from the humanities sector, it may be another generation, honestly, of thinking about this. You see more understanding of that kind of form, content issue, oddly enough, with people from film and television discourses and communication discourses than you do from literary studies. No matter what Kate Hale says about media-specific analysis or the development of language, the number of people who said to me, God, Kate Hales did a really interesting job making that book that was, Writing Machines, that was designed by Ann Burdick, right? I wish I could be more sanguine about it, but rage is part of my personality.
Yeah, with 10 print, we felt that we were doing a lot of experimental things with the book, and so the actual layout and design is totally straightforward. So I don't think anybody would think to mention it. It's a straightforward academic. But we tried to make careful decisions about it and to make it special, but we didn't sort of use design in a way to in a non-standard way. So I don't think it really would call itself out to the reader. The idea actually is for it to appear as a standard academic text.
Okay, well, I would have to disagree because we have a contentious collaboration. Based on the reviews that I've read, the design of the book comes up quite frequently. Now, does it go beyond, this is a really pretty blue book with cool pictures in it that reminds us of the C64 handbook? Or does it go deep enough into that critique, into thinking about how the argument is embedded in it? I guess I'd have to look back at the reviews, but the other thing is we're all claiming that we wrote a book, but it's quite possible that we've created something of which this talk is a part of. So, I just want to raise that possibility too. And every time Nick gives this presentation, he lugs his old C64 here through airport security. He's got funny stories about that. And then he does that thing that we just saw. He types in the program and runs it. So that's part of this not book project as well, as far as I'm concerned. So, I don't know.
Heck, the only thing missing from your user manual, as I told Mark, was the spiral binding that originally was there at the Commodore 64. Even has the same, the paper even feels the same as the mine. And so it's extraordinary that you're both updating and reworking and citing the user manual as the object for this investigation. Not to mention that's the chapter organization by, of course, the numbers of 10, 20, 65, and so forth for those I forget what you call them, the REM discussions. We had thought about at one point in our discussions as to whether we were going to have a choral, I think there was discussion whether we would have a choral voice, which is what we end up going for, or if we were going to foreground some like debate, like almost like sidebars at one point. And there was discussion, I think, relatively early on about a piece that Johanna wrote and a response that I wrote. And then we decided that wasn't what we wanted to do. We really wanted to we would come back together and we would work through what the issues were in order to arrive at essentially a kind of consensus, so that in fact all of us would feel that we could take ownership for any one part of it, and that's exactly what we did. But there were these questions early on in the process as to how we would think about multiplicity and heterogeneity of our voices, and how that it's still, to a certain extent, it's not as if everything reads in a kind of monolith type of way. I mean, at the end of the day, of course, you're still 5 individuals with different perspectives and experiences and ways of placing emphases on different things. But I think it had been rewritten in this round robin process so many times that at the end you did arrive at something that was choral, but maybe not unison.
Thank you. My name is Ivan Rostock from Oslo. I think both of these book projects are really interesting, and they seem to be both projects within what we can call digital humanities. And I was wondering a little bit in what way they would address the future of digital humanities, if it's possible, if some of you could, based on your specific experiences in these projects, if you can say something about what turned out to be the advantages and disadvantages of digital humanities research. Did any of you feel, based on these collaborations, that you in any way came closer to what could possibly be the essence of digital humanities as far as method, theory, or object is concerned?
Thank you for that question, and I'm sure we would all answer this differently, but I think I sense within our community, and that by which I would mean both the community here at UCLA and the community with which we hope the book is in dialogue, that we have certain aspirations, and some of those aspirations are very sort of straightforward, which would be to insist on the value of digital fluencies and literacies, that these are new ways of thinking analytically, critically, engaging with the legacy of cultural materials, that we think that knowing how to do data mining and distant reading, and that thinking in terms of modeling virtual worlds and understanding classification and structured data and unstructured data, that these are basic fundamentals for the generation of scholars that we are training and engaged with. So to me, that's the aspirational aspect that's institutional and shared within the community. In terms of intellectual goals, my hope is always that we will continue to push towards this idea of the humanistic that we talked about earlier, that there are ways in which humanistic values that are a method, and design values which are a method, that these are ways of constituting knowledge and thinking about the fundamental inquiry into how we understand the world and our experience of it, will return to push against some of the assumptions that computational methods have kind of twisted our arms into thinking are essential, and we know they're not. So I think for me there are two futures there. One has to do with just consolidating a set of fundamentals that will enable and empower broad communities of practice, and the other has to do with believing that there are areas of research that are still quite esoteric in the way they need to be articulated to continue to push that envelope. It's not a matter simply of integrating tools and methods and then we're done, but of seeing how that enables us to continue to think differently about the nature of knowledge itself.
So I was listening very carefully, and I'm not sure if I'm making the same point that Joanna was just making. Someone from the Twitter audience pointed out that there are 2 women and 5 men on this panel. And if we had the rest of the 10 print authors here, that gender divide would be a little bit more pronounced, I would say, as would certain other demographic aspects. And so when I think about the future of digital humanities, I think the future rests with the transformed DH community. And I think there are certain social factors that go beyond questions of simplistic integration that I hope are at the future of this particular set of inquiries. Again, when we went, now, in that context with 10 print, Nick asked everybody he could possibly ask, as far as I could tell, if they wanted to be authors on this book, everybody who might have interest. And this is the 10 who had interest. Now, are there particular you know, again, identity issues that might lead a particular group that's heavily skewed towards, again, Caucasian males to want to write about this particular object? I would argue probably yes. But future books, hopefully, will look at future objects, and again, those future sets of authors will hopefully also look different as well. So.
Can you elaborate why you would argue yes?
What?
You just said you would argue yes, that more males would be interested to write about this. Can you elaborate on that argument?
Well,
Speaking as an individual, not as a representative of the 10 print team.
yeah, right, exactly. Well, okay, so when we pushed this question of the social a little bit in 10 print research, we did not see a huge gender divide in terms of access to the Commodore 64 in the early 1980s. Again, for me, I think about Doug Thomas's work on geek culture as it being a boy culture, and the parts of that are, again, Nick knows, I feel like Nick knows creative computing culture better than I do, so I'm speaking of it more anecdotally and through other people's research. But again, it seems to be one that, at least at current, seems to build more on some aspects of it, on male-driven nostalgia. That said, when we put that call out for people,
I wouldn't say nostalgia.
when we put, I see that as, when we put out when we put out that call for people to tell. One time we did this over Twitter for people to tell early stories of BASIC, and certainly those responses, again, at least in terms of gender balance, were much richer than I anticipated from the particular ratio that we saw on the authorship of 10 print.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, there's different communities, electronic literature community, digital art community, perhaps are quite different in terms of their representation by people of different genders than, for instance, the demo scene, which is a Northern European community, the major group that still is programming Commodore 64s as part of their practice. And you can go to a large-scale, demo party where there's an auditorium full of people with computers set up and find realistically 3 or 4 women in that entire group. There are, which is, and that's not to say that people are uniformly that they're mean to women or that they're bad people or whatever else. But but the nature of the community is such that that's it. On the other hand, as Mark pointed out, we were surprised to find that according to U.S. Census data in the early 1980s, there was only a small divide in terms of access between men and women around 1982.
And even computer science majors, right? The early computer science majors numbers.
And then it decreased. And this has to do with women having access to data processing and computing technologies in the workplace and secretarial jobs, which men did not have in some cases. So there's much to be looked at. We did try to touch on that in its relationship to this program and how it was that people encountered this in a hobbyist programming context. So I think there's much more than a side comment to be made about this, but I think there's also something behind that worth investigating, that Mark mentioned.
One thing that I would say is that digital humanities as a field, the DH book that we wrote, and 10 print, I think really point to how humanist research is still incredibly important. And I don't know, you said you were from Oslo, I don't know what's happening in Norway at the moment, but I can tell you that in the US, and even in our great bear state of California, we are getting a pushback right now from people saying that, what are you people doing research for? You need to be teaching. You must just stop all this writing of inessential books and spend your time teaching these 18 to 22-year-olds that we've entrusted into your care and that we are paying for. And I think that these two projects show the absolute centrality and the interrelationship of research as a practice and pedagogy as a practice, that they're developing an entire way of being in the classroom that potentially can be transformative, that's engaging with students in different ways, and that is also pushing our ideas about knowledge formation in really productive ways. And that I, for one, refuse to stop and just sort of say, all the research that's been done, I'm delighted to teach it now. You know, but I'm not going to bother with doing it myself, because all our knowledge is in one big bag. And I think that that's one of the things that projects like this can prove. The point behind Digital Humanities is not just answering the old questions quicker. It's about coming up, right, with new ways of asking questions that generate new answers that we didn't know the questions for before we started the research. So.
Right. And just to underscore the teaching and research interconnection, the origin of this book, if we go back to this seminar that Jeffrey and I had organized at UCLA back in 2008, called What Is and Isn't Digital Humanities, involved Peter and involved Johanna, and pretty soon thereafter Anne was brought in, because, well, first of all, because we were reading many of the books that she had designed, but then later it was through a conference that you organized that was a research conference that then influenced teaching again, and then the DH program at UCLA emerged, and so it's none of these things happened individually. That is to say, there are constantly kind of feedback loops between the trying out in the classroom, the experimental on all levels, from undergraduate introductory classes that were designed, our 101 classes, up to our graduate seminars. The idea that we held this first class in Second Life, which was totally interesting. We had a whole group of 80 avatars from around the world that participated with the 40 that were here in the UCLA's, what do we have, in the visualization portal. And this was the first attempt, you know, back in 2008 to think through what the contours of digital humanities might be, and looking at a lot of practices and practitioners. And so this is kind of one of the iterative aspects of this book. The fact that it ended up in a book is because I think we reached a point where we wanted to put some things down because they were so important, they had to be said, they were compelling, and that they were changing practice and institutions. And institutional forms were coming into being that weren't there before, and other institutions were struggling with developing their own programs and ways of evaluating and so forth. And so there was a timing element that was important here. But I think it was always fluid between the research and the teaching, and even, I'd say, the kind of outreach that happened by involving publics that we weren't even always aware of. I mean, think of the manifesto, right? And which is another, you know, whether it's fulminations or praise, and it was all these things, it was many people participating in discussions about the contours, changing contours, emerging contours, the punctures of digital humanities.
You know, and you want to have a last word? Have the last word.
Yeah.
Have the last word.
A lot of pressure. While we were in the middle of doing this book, I did a research project over the summer with a number of students where we took the case studies that we had constructed, and we sort of mapped out the state of the technologies that were being used in each of these stories, whether it was different, you know, certain kind of scanning equipment or analytical tools, or, you know, and seeing sort of how it would be done today. And then we kind of were looking at what was emerging from the tech companies and from scientific research, and saying, you know, 5 years out, how will this work be done? You know, with what tools and by whom? Right. And then to sort of like even go 10 years out further. And the result of that was a design fiction, which was basically like a day in the life of a humanities scholar who basically lives in the desert and never sees anyone in person, but teaches around the globe at various institutions, and, you know, with her always on tech thing, you know, one of these future tech fantasies. But what we learned in doing that was the inseparability of the institutional infrastructures, the sort of, you know, social expectations and patterns, and the way in which the technology, the way in which people engage with the technology. And so, because the tools that we use are continuing to change, it seems like one of the things that I know in our book that we're trying to point toward is, you know, how do we find a foothold in a world of sort of this constant technological change and an institutional change. And I don't know, I guess I would just say that I've just been involved recently in a number of high-level conversations with provosts and deans and presidents about the future of the institution itself, and I think we can't look at this question without looking at that in connection with it. I don't know, that was valuable.
Yeah. Thanks very much for joining us and sticking with us.